February 3, 1945. Dusk is falling over Manila. The air is thick with the scent of tropical rot, cordite, and the charcoal smoke of a city beginning to burn. For 3 years, the University of Santo Tomas has been a silent island of misery. Behind its high stone walls, nearly 4,000 civilians, mostly Americans and British, have been reduced to living skeletons. They are waiting for a rescue many no longer believe is coming. The silence is shattered by the mechanical roar of the 44th Tank Battalion. AM for Sherman tank, nicknamed Georgia Peach, strikes the main gate. The iron bars groan and snap. The tank lurches forward into the courtyard, its treads grinding against the gravel. Behind it, the flying column of the 1st Cavalry Division pours through the breach. Private First Class Manuel Perez watches from the line. The scene is surreal. The prisoners do not cheer at first. They stand in the shadows of the campus buildings, gaunt and hollow-eyed. They look like ghosts appearing in the glare of the American searchlights. The Japanese guards, stunned by the speed of the assault, retreat toward the education building. Rifles are leveled. The air is electric with the threat of a final desperate massacre. Among the rescuers are women of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. They are wearing olive-drab fatigues, their pockets stuffed with sulfa powder and emergency rations. As they move toward the infirmary, they encounter the Japanese medical staff civilian nurses who have spent years hearing that the Americans are monsters who would execute them on sight. The Japanese women shrink back against the damp stone walls, their faces masks of terror. The Americans stop. There is no gunfire here, only the heavy breathing of exhausted soldiers and the distant rumble of artillery from the city center. A captain in the Nurse Corps reaches into her pack. She does not pull out a weapon. She pulls out a small, shimmering package of DuPont nylons. The tension of 3 years of occupation begins to break, not with a treaty, but with a gesture that defies the logic of the Pacific War. In January 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army entered Manila, declaring it an open city. The University of Santo Tomas, the oldest university in Asia, was immediately designated as the primary internment camp for enemy aliens. For the 3,700 civilians trapped inside, the following 37 months were a slow descent into deprivation. The strategic stakes were absolute. To the Japanese High Command, holding Manila was the key to controlling the Philippines and denying the United States a staging ground for the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. By late 1944, the situation grew dire. General Douglas MacArthur had landed at Lae, fulfilling his promise to return. But for those inside Santo Tomas, the news was a double-edged sword. As the American forces drew closer, Japanese supply lines collapsed. The daily ration for internees plummeted to 700 calories, then 500. Men and women died of beriberi and starvation within sight of the city's markets. The Japanese guards were under immense political pressure. The no-surrender policy meant that, as the Americans approached, the internees were no longer just prisoners, they were potential liabilities to be liquidated. The liberating force, the 1st Cavalry Division, was ordered by MacArthur to form a flying column. Their mission was a high-speed 60-mile dash through enemy territory, specifically to save the prisoners before the Japanese could execute them. This was not merely a tactical move, it was a race against time and human cruelty. Command decisions at the highest levels prioritized Santo Tomas, because the moral stakes were as high as the military ones. The liberation of these civilians would serve as the ultimate proof of American resolve and the failure of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Simultaneously, a technological and industrial chasm had opened between the two nations. While Japan struggled to produce enough cotton and wool for its soldiers' uniforms, American industry was operating at a scale previously unseen in human history. In 1939, DuPont had introduced nylon, a synthetic miracle that replaced silk. By 1942, all nylon production was diverted to the military for parachutes and tire cords. However, by early 1945, small amounts of these luxury goods were finding their way into the kits of American nurses. These stockings were more than apparel. They were symbols of a nation so wealthy and industrially dominant that it could provide its female soldiers with items that were effectively currency in the war-torn Pacific. To the Japanese nurses, who were mending their own uniforms with coarse fibers, the sheer existence of such a material was a quiet, devastating revelation of the industrial reality of the war. As the 1st Cavalry consolidated the courtyard, the liberation hit a staggering complication. While the main grounds were secure, 65 Japanese soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Toshio Hayashi had barricaded themselves in the education building. They held 275 internees as human shields. The standoff turned the university into a microcosm of the battle for Manila. Outside the gates, the city was transforming into a slaughterhouse as Japanese Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi ignored orders to evacuate, instead commanding his 17,000 sailors to fight for every block. Inside the camp, the tactical pressure was suffocating. American tanks had their main guns leveled at the building, but they could not fire without killing the very people they had come to rescue. For 2 days, negotiations dragged on in the sweltering heat. The Japanese soldiers were hungry, exhausted, and increasingly erratic. Among them were medical orderlies and civilian staff who had watched their empire's logistics disintegrate. They were wearing uniforms that were fraying at the seams, their boots reinforced with twine. They had been told for years that the American industrial devils were collapsing under the weight of the war. The arrival of the 80th North Carolina General Hospital Unit added a new layer to the scene. The American nurses moved with a brisk, well-fed efficiency that was jarring to the observers. They began setting up triage stations, unpacking crates of penicillin, morphine, and canned sea rations. The Japanese civilian nurses, still restricted to the areas held by Hayashi's men, or huddled in neutral corners of the infirmary, watched with a mixture of suspicion and awe. They saw American women handling supplies that had not been seen in the Philippines since 1941. The Red Line defense of Manila was now claiming thousands of lives just streets away. But inside the education building, a strange cultural friction was mounting. The Japanese staff observed the Americans opening comfort packages. These contained soap that actually laddered, Hershey bars, and the fabled DuPont nylons. To the Japanese nurses, who had been living on meager portions of lugao rice, gruel, and wearing coarse, scratchy fabrics, the Americans looked like they were from another century. The miscalculation of the Japanese propaganda machine was becoming visible. The Americans were not the starving, desperate barbarians they had been promised. They were the harbingers of an abundance that the Japanese nurses could no longer comprehend. On the morning of February 5th, a tense agreement was finally reached. To save the lives of the 275 hostages, the Americans allowed Colonel Hayashi and his 64 men to be escorted, armed only with sidearms and rifles, to a point near the Japanese lines at the Malakagan Palace. As the Japanese soldiers filed out in a grim, silent column, the education building was finally opened. The American nurses rushed in, moving past the departing soldiers to reach the emaciated survivors. In the chaotic aftermath of the handover, a group of American nurses encountered the Japanese civilian nurses who had remained behind. The Japanese women were huddled together, expecting the traditional brutality of a conquering army. Instead, the Americans began a process of forced kindness. They shared their own rations. But the most profound moment occurred when a few American nurses opened their personal footlockers. One nurse, documented in local accounts, pulled out several pairs of DuPont nylons. These were high-gauge sheer stockings, a luxury that had vanished from the world market years prior. She handed them directly to the Japanese women. The Japanese nurses took the fabric between their fingers. It was smooth, elastic, and impossibly fine. It was a physical manifestation of a manufacturing capability that Japan simply did not possess. The reaction was immediate and documented. The Japanese nurses began to cry. They did not cry from physical pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming collapse of their worldview. They had been told that American women were decadent and weak, and that the United States was a crumbling society. Holding the nylon situms of such high quality and unnecessary beauty in the middle of a war zone-shattered the propaganda. They bowed deeply, some falling to their knees, clutching the stockings as if they were religious relics. In that minute, the total war mindset died. The sheer disparity in resources, symbolized by a pair of stockings, made the inevitability of Japan's defeat a tangible, tearful reality. The battle for Manila continued for another month, ultimately claiming the lives of over 100,000 Filipino civilians and reducing the Pearl of the Orient to rubble. When the dust settled, the city was the second most devastated Allied capital of the war, surpassed only by Warsaw. Amidst this wreckage, the liberation of Santo Tomas stood as a rare, successful rescue operation. Of the nearly 4,000 internees, the vast majority survived, though many carried the physical and psychological scars of starvation for the rest of their lives. The fate of the Japanese medical staff mirrored the collapse of the empire they served. Many were repatriated to a Japan that was itself starving and scorched by firebombing. The tears shed over the American nylons were a precursor to the nylon culture that would define the post-war occupation. During the rebuilding of Japan, these same stockings became a primary form of currency and a symbol of the rapid westernization that followed the surrender. The gesture at Santo Tomas was not just an act of charity, it was a bridge between the total animosity of the Pacific War and the complex, intertwined future of the two nations. The strategic shift following the liberation was total. General MacArthur established his headquarters in Manila. Using the city as the springboard for the final push toward the Japanese mainland, the logistical superiority demonstrated in the infirmaries of Santo Tomas was soon reflected in the massive armadas and air fleets that tightened the noose around Japan. The war was won not just by the caliber of the guns, but by the capacity of the factories. The legacy of the Silk Exchange remains a footnote in the grand tactical histories of World War II, yet it offers a grounded reflection on the nature of conflict. It serves as a reminder that even in a theater defined by racial hatred and uncompromising brutality, human connection can be triggered by the simplest of objects. The Japanese nurses did not cry because they were defeated by a weapon. They cried because they were confronted with a humanity and an abundance they had been taught did not exist.